Clara adjusted the strap of her plain handbag and stepped out of the bus, the morning sun painting golden streaks across the busy street. Her shoes were slightly worn, her dress simple, and her hair tied back in a neat bun. To anyone passing by, she looked like an ordinary woman, someone who might be going to the market or perhaps to visit a friend. But Clara had come with a very different purpose that day. She was heading to the city courthouse, a place where people dressed in tailored suits, carried leather briefcases, and spoke in complicated words that often made little sense to ordinary ears. As she walked toward the grand courthouse building, Clara could feel the eyes of strangers scanning her. Some glanced at her clothes, others at her calm but modest appearance. To them, she did not look like someone who belonged inside. She did not look like a lawyer or a professional. She looked too plain, too simple, too ordinary. But Clara kept walking, her steps steady, her eyes fixed ahead. The courthouse was buzzing with activity. Lawyers hurried in and out, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. Clerks carried piles of papers from one room to another. Families sat on benches waiting nervously for their cases to be heard. Inside the main courtroom, the judge, a man known for his strictness and sharp tongue, was already seated. He was the kind of man who liked order, respect, and power. People feared him not only because of his position but also because of the way he treated anyone who dared to stand unprepared in his courtroom. When Clara entered the courtroom, a few heads turned. She did not walk in with the authority of a trained lawyer. Instead, she carried herself with quiet composure. She chose a seat near the front, close enough to see the judge clearly. A few attorneys whispered to one another, exchanging smirks as they noticed her plain dress and lack of professional presence. To them, she was just another naive woman who thought she could handle the seriousness of the law. The case being discussed was personal to Clara. She was not there for someone else, she was there for herself. It was a matter that deeply affected her life, and instead of hiring a lawyer, she had decided to stand before the judge alone. Many people thought she was foolish for this. "You can't face the court without a lawyer," one neighbor had told her. "The judge will destroy you," another had warned. But Clara had chosen to represent herself, and she had prepared in her own quiet way. The judge noticed her as soon as she stood up to speak. He adjusted his glasses and frowned slightly, his eyes moving from her plain dress to her calm face. To him, she looked out of place. She did not belong to the polished world of law. With a small smirk, he leaned forward and asked in a firm voice, "Are you here without counsel, ma'am?" "Yes, Your Honor," Clara replied softly but with confidence. "I am here to represent myself." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Some lawyers chuckled quietly, shaking their heads. A clerk raised his eyebrows as if to say, "This will be interesting." The judge allowed the laughter for a moment before raising his hand for silence. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Clara again. In his mind, she was already defeated. He believed she would not last even 10 minutes under questioning. "Very well," the judge said with a tone that carried both authority and sarcasm. "Let us proceed." Clara stood calmly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had spent weeks studying her case, reading through books and documents late into the night. She had memorized details, highlighted important sections, and rehearsed her arguments. But no one in that courtroom knew this. To them, she was just a simple woman about to make a fool of herself. The judge began with questions, his voice sharp and deliberate. He asked her about technicalities, using legal terms meant to confuse. The lawyers in the room leaned back in their chairs, waiting for her to stumble. Even the spectators whispered among themselves, expecting her to fall apart. But Clara did not stumble. She listened carefully, took a brief pause, and then answered clearly. Her words were simple, but her knowledge showed. She referred to sections of law, mentioning them with precision. At first, people thought it was luck. Maybe she had memorized 1 or 2 lines. But as the questions continued, Clara kept answering, each response more surprising than the last. The judge, however, was not impressed yet. He leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed tightly together, and asked harder questions. He interrupted her when she tried to explain, raising his voice slightly to remind her who was in charge. Still, Clara did not lose her composure. She remained respectful, addressing him as Your Honor each time, but her answers grew sharper, filled with clarity that even made a few attorneys glance at her with new curiosity. One lawyer whispered to another, "She knows the law." The other shook his head, "She must have had help. There's no way she learned all this alone." But Clara had. Every evening, after finishing her work and chores, she had spent hours with borrowed books, online materials, and handwritten notes. She had studied like her life depended on it because it did. The judge continued to push, his smirk slowly fading as Clara's answers became stronger. He noticed something he had not expected: she was not just repeating words. She understood them. She connected laws to real-life situations. She explained things in a way that was simple yet undeniable. By now, the courtroom had grown silent. The earlier chuckles had disappeared. The spectators leaned forward, the clerks stopped moving papers, and even the lawyers who once mocked her were paying attention. Clara's voice, though calm, filled the room with quiet authority. Still, the judge was not ready to give her respect. He tapped his pen against the desk, staring at her with narrowed eyes. Deep inside, he felt a strange mix of irritation and curiosity. Who was this woman? How did she, with no formal training, stand before him so confidently? He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, she was holding her ground. Clara, on the other hand, did not care about the whispers or the smirks. She cared only about the truth. She was not there to prove herself to anyone. She was there for justice, and she knew she could not let fear silence her. As the first session came to an end, the atmosphere of the courtroom had shifted. What began as a scene of mockery now carried tension, curiosity, and a strange kind of respect. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Clara gathered her papers, her face calm as ever. In that moment, no one knew what would happen next. But one thing was certain: the judge had underestimated her. The simple woman he thought would crumble had instead stood firm. And this was only the beginning. The next day in the courthouse, the room was more crowded than before. Word had already spread about the simple woman who had surprised everyone by standing up to the judge without fear. Some people had come out of curiosity, others because they could not believe what they had heard. A few young law students even slipped into the back row, eager to watch how the unusual case would unfold. Clara walked in quietly, her same plain handbag on her shoulder, her shoes polished but still simple, her dress neat but not expensive. She looked no different from the day before, yet there was something new in the way people looked at her. She did not seem nervous. Instead, she walked with the same calm determination that had startled the court the first time. She chose her seat at the front, close to the judge's bench, and carefully placed her papers on the table. Around her, lawyers in fine suits exchanged whispers. Some rolled their eyes, dismissing her as lucky on the first day. Others were more cautious, wondering if she truly had the knowledge to continue matching the judge. The judge entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing, his expression sharp. He glanced around before settling his eyes on Clara. His face gave nothing away, but inside, he felt a prick of annoyance. He had not expected her to last this long. He had tried to test her, even humiliate her, yet she had stood her ground. Today, he decided, he would push her harder. The session began, and almost immediately, the judge started with a strong tone. "Yesterday, you gave answers that surprised this court," he said, his voice echoing across the room. "But let us see if you truly understand the law, or if you were simply reciting lines you memorized." There was a low murmur among the spectators. Clara stood slowly, her posture straight, and gave a small nod. "I am ready, Your Honor," she said politely. The judge began firing questions one after another, each more complicated than the last. He used technical terms, cited unusual cases, and twisted scenarios in ways that would confuse even seasoned lawyers. His questions were not just about facts, they were designed to trap her, to make her contradict herself, to show that she was not as capable as she appeared. At first, the room expected Clara to falter. She was just a woman with no law degree, after all. But once again, Clara listened patiently to each question, her eyes focused, her hands resting lightly on the table. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. "Yes, Your Honor," she said after one question, "but if you recall Section 112, Paragraph 3, it explains clearly that the situation you described would not apply here. That section specifically protects individuals in cases like mine." The courtroom grew silent. Even the judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. He had not expected her to know such details. Another question followed. This time, the judge brought up a precedent from many years ago, a case most lawyers in the room had never even heard of. "Do you know about the case of Harper v. State, 1984, he asked, his tone filled with challenge. Clara took a breath, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. That case was about a man accused of misusing property rights. The decision was overturned because the state could not prove intent. The ruling also created a standard for fairness that is still used today. In fact, it directly supports my argument." Gasps filled the room. Lawyers exchanged shocked looks. Even the students at the back quickly scribbled down notes. Clara had not only remembered the case but explained its importance better than many professionals could. The judge leaned back slightly, his lips tightening. He tapped his pen against the desk, his eyes narrowing at her. He could feel his authority being tested in a way it never had before. But he was not ready to give in. He leaned forward again and asked, "And what about recent reforms? Laws change. Are you aware of the new adjustments made just last year?" Clara smiled faintly, almost as if she had expected that question. "Yes, Your Honor. The reforms were meant to simplify the process for ordinary people. The revisions clarified the protections that were often hidden behind complicated language. If anything, the reforms make my position stronger, not weaker." The judge blinked, his smirk gone. Around the room, there was a strange tension building. The people who had laughed at her the day before now sat silently, their respect for Clara growing with every word she spoke. Still, the judge continued. He raised his voice slightly, interrupting her answers, trying to push her into frustration. "That is not what I asked," he snapped once, cutting her off mid-sentence. The room went still. Everyone waited to see if Clara would falter under his harsh tone. But Clara did not falter. She lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked up again with quiet dignity. "Forgive me, Your Honor," she said softly, "but I believe it is exactly what you asked. And I answered as clearly as I could." There was a pause. Even the judge was caught off guard by her composure. He had expected her to grow flustered, maybe even break down. Instead, her calm respect only made her stronger. Minutes turned into an hour as the exchange continued. The judge's questions grew more complicated, but Clara's answers grew sharper. She explained laws not just by quoting them but by connecting them to real life, by showing how they applied to ordinary people. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. She made the law understandable, stripping away the heavy language that often confused others. By the middle of the session, the entire courtroom had shifted. The people who had mocked her were now listening carefully. Some lawyers even began nodding in agreement with her points. The clerks stopped their quiet tasks and leaned in to hear her words. The students at the back whispered to one another, amazed at how she handled herself. The judge's irritation was clear. His voice grew sharper, his tone heavier, but his attempts to control the situation only highlighted Clara's strength. The more he tried to embarrass her, the more she revealed her knowledge. It was as if the courtroom was slowly tilting in her favor. At one point, Clara paused after giving an answer and noticed the silence around her. Everyone was watching her, waiting for her next words. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of their expectations. But she reminded herself why she was there. She was not there for applause or admiration. She was there for justice, for the truth, and for her own dignity. As the session came to a close, the judge looked at her with a mix of frustration and something else, something closer to respect, though he would not admit it yet. He banged his gavel and announced that the hearing would continue on another day. Clara quietly gathered her papers, placed them neatly back into her bag, and gave a small respectful nod before leaving the courtroom. As she walked out, people whispered in amazement. A few even smiled at her, their earlier judgment replaced with admiration. The judge remained seated for a while after she had gone, his face stern but his thoughts unsettled. He had tried to humiliate her again, but instead, she had stood taller, stronger, and wiser than before. And though he would never say it out loud, deep inside, he knew, this was no ordinary woman. The morning of the third hearing felt different. By now, the courthouse had become a stage, and Clara was at the center of it. What had started as whispers of curiosity had grown into open anticipation. People who had not cared about her case before now came early just to find a seat in the courtroom. Clerks, law students, even lawyers not connected to the case slipped in quietly, eager to watch the woman who had left the judge speechless more than once. Clara arrived in her usual way, without drama, without showing any pride. She carried the same simple bag, wore another plain dress, and walked with steady steps. Her modest appearance fooled no one this time. The crowd no longer saw her as just a simple woman. They saw her as someone who had knowledge, courage, and the ability to stand against one of the most feared judges in the city. Inside, the judge sat in his high chair, his robe perfectly pressed, his face stern. He tried to maintain his usual authority, but something in his eyes revealed a quiet irritation. He had spent nights thinking about her. It bothered him that she, an untrained woman, had managed to answer his questions with such precision. He was determined to prove she was not as extraordinary as she appeared. Today, he planned to push her harder than ever. The gavel struck, and the session began. Almost immediately, the judge launched into deep and complex questions. This time, he brought out cases that were rare, technical, and often forgotten, the kind of cases lawyers usually needed hours to prepare for. He spoke with quick words, layering question after question, hoping to confuse her. Clara listened carefully, never rushing to answer. She would take a breath, sometimes close her eyes for a second, and then respond. What amazed everyone was not only that she remembered the details but that she explained them in a way anyone could understand. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied at one point, "but that case cannot apply here. It was decided under old rules, and since then, several amendments have changed the way the law protects individuals. If we look at the changes in 1992 and later in 2010, they directly strengthen my position." The audience stirred. A lawyer sitting near the front whispered to his colleague, "How does she know this? I had to look it up last year." The judge tightened his jaw. He leaned forward, his voice sharper. "And what about the case of Donovan versus Central Authority, 1976? Surely, you have no knowledge of that?" Clara looked straight at him, her eyes calm. "Yes, Your Honor. Donovan's case was about property misuse and government overreach. The court ruled against the authority because they failed to respect constitutional rights. That ruling is still important today, especially when citizens defend themselves against unfair treatment." The room fell silent. Some people's mouths dropped open. Not only did she know the case, but she connected it to the heart of her own argument with ease. The judge shifted in his chair. His fingers tapped the wooden desk, his expression hard to read. He felt the weight of the courtroom pressing against him. For years, he had enjoyed complete control. No one dared challenge his authority. But Clara was different. She was not disrespectful, not rebellious, yet her presence was shaking his confidence. As the questioning went on, something new began to happen. Clara's answers started weaving a picture, connecting cases across decades, linking them to reforms, tying them back to her own matter. It was as though she was slowly building a strong tower of truth in front of everyone, one brick at a time. The higher it grew, the harder it became for anyone to ignore. The spectators leaned forward, caught in the drama. Some lawyers scribbled notes, realizing they were learning from her. A few even smiled, quietly rooting for her. For the first time in years, the courtroom was not just a place of fear and procedure, it was alive, breathing with energy. The judge tried one last tactic. He raised his voice, cutting her off mid-sentence. Enough. You speak as though you are a lawyer. But you are not. Do you even understand the responsibility of your words? Clara paused. For a brief moment, the room seemed to freeze. Then she answered softly but firmly, I understand, Your Honor. I may not wear a lawyer's robe, and I may not have studied in a university, but the law belongs to the people. It is meant to protect us. If we cannot understand it, then what good is it? I studied because I had no choice. I speak because this is my right. Her words fell into the room like a heavy weight. The silence that followed was not of mockery but of respect. People shifted uncomfortably, not because they doubted her, but because her truth was undeniable. For the first time, the judge did not respond immediately. He stared at her, his face stiff, but inside, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: doubt. Doubt in his own arrogance, doubt in the belief that knowledge only belonged to those with titles and degrees. By now, the courtroom had completely changed. No one laughed at Clara anymore. No one smirked at her plain clothes. She stood tall, not because of power or wealth, but because of her courage and wisdom. As the hearing came to a close, Clara presented one final argument for the day. She pulled out a sheet of paper, an old record she had discovered after nights of searching. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, this is a case that mirrors mine almost completely. The ruling was in favor of the individual. I believe it shows that justice must be given fairly today. The judge leaned forward, studying the paper. His face tightened. He could not deny it. She had found something even seasoned lawyers had missed. The gavel struck. The judge's voice was controlled, but quieter than usual. This session is adjourned. We will continue tomorrow. Clara gathered her papers as usual, bowing her head slightly in respect before leaving. As she walked out, people stood aside, giving her space. Some even nodded at her in admiration. She did not smile proudly, but her calm eyes revealed a quiet satisfaction. Behind her, the judge remained seated, his mind heavy. He had set out to humiliate her, to prove she was nothing but an ordinary woman pretending to be wise. Instead, she had forced him to see the truth. He could no longer deny it. Clara was no ordinary woman. She was something far greater. And though the final judgment had not yet come, one thing was already certain: the courtroom, and the people within it, would never see her the same way again. The fourth day of the hearing felt heavier than all the others. By now, the courthouse had become almost like a theater. Every seat was filled, and people even stood against the walls, hoping to catch a glimpse of the simple woman who had shaken the confidence of a powerful judge. The atmosphere buzzed with whispers, but the moment Clara stepped through the wooden doors, silence spread like a wave. She looked the same as always: plain dress, simple shoes, her hair neatly tied back. Yet everyone saw her differently now. They no longer noticed the simplicity of her clothes, they noticed the strength in her walk, the calmness in her eyes, and the quiet determination she carried with her. Clara was no longer invisible. She was the heart of the story everyone wanted to see unfold. The judge entered a few minutes later. His expression was even sterner than usual. He carried the weight of his pride on his shoulders. For 3 days, he had tried to control the situation, to humiliate Clara, to prove that she was just an ordinary woman with no real standing. Yet, every day, she had risen higher, turning the tide of the courtroom against him. Today, he was determined not to lose. He would push her to her absolute limit. The gavel struck, and the session began. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharper than ever. "Today," he said firmly, "you will prove whether you truly understand the law or whether you've been lucky until now." Clara stood, her face calm, and gave a small nod. "I am ready, Your Honor." The questions began immediately. They were not just about past cases or laws anymore. They were twisted puzzles, built to trap her into contradiction. The judge crafted scenarios that mixed legal complexity with moral confusion. He wanted to show that knowledge alone was not enough, that she would eventually stumble. But Clara did not stumble. She listened carefully, sometimes closing her eyes for a moment before answering. Her words were measured, her tone respectful, but her arguments sharp as a blade. Each time the judge tried to trap her, she found her way out, explaining the logic clearly and referencing laws with precision. At one point, the judge raised his voice in frustration. "You speak of laws and rights," he snapped, "but do you even understand the deeper principles of justice? It is not about quoting words, it is about interpretation, about wisdom." Clara's eyes met his firmly. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the silent courtroom. "Justice, Your Honor, is not about hiding behind complicated words. Justice is about truth, fairness, and humanity. If the law cannot serve the people it is meant to protect, then it loses its meaning. Wisdom is not in using words to confuse, it is in using them to reveal clarity." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Many nodded, some even clapped before being hushed. The judge's face tightened, his pride stung by her words. He gripped his gavel, striking it down for order, but his authority no longer felt absolute. The people's hearts were with Clara. The judge pressed on. He brought out thick legal texts, citing obscure clauses, confident that this time, she would not have the answer. He quoted directly from heavy pages, reading aloud in a tone filled with authority. Then he slammed the book shut and said, "Now tell me, do you know what that means?" Clara walked slowly to her table, picked up her own worn stack of papers, and flipped through them calmly. She found the same clause he had mentioned, underlined in her own handwriting. Looking up, she said, "Yes, Your Honor. And if you continue reading beyond the part you quoted, you will see that it clearly states exceptions that apply directly to my case. By stopping midway, you left out the most important part." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge froze. Everyone turned their eyes to him. He had tried to use his authority to trap her, but she had caught him leaving out a key detail. For a long moment, silence ruled the room. The judge's face darkened. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers gripping the arms tightly. For the first time, he felt the weight of defeat pressing against him. But still, he refused to admit it. "Do not think," he said coldly, "that knowing a few lines makes you greater than this court." Clara shook her head gently. "I do not think that, Your Honor. But I believe the truth is greater than pride. And truth is what this court should serve." Her words echoed in the room, simple yet powerful. Everyone could feel the shift. The power the judge had wielded so easily in the beginning was slipping away. Clara was no longer the one on trial, his fairness, his arrogance, and his integrity were now being judged by the people watching. The session continued, but the energy was different now. Clara began weaving her arguments into a strong, flawless speech. She cited cases across decades, reforms across years, and decisions from the highest courts. She connected them like threads in a tapestry, each piece fitting perfectly. It was not just knowledge, it was mastery. By the final hour, the judge could no longer hide his frustration. Sweat beaded at his temples. His usual smirk had disappeared. He asked fewer questions, his voice weaker. Clara, meanwhile, grew stronger with every word. Her calmness never broke, her respect never faltered, but her wisdom shone brighter than ever. Finally, she placed her last piece of evidence on the table. It was a case file she had discovered after weeks of research, almost forgotten in the archives. She lifted it with steady hands and said, "Your Honor, this case is nearly identical to mine. The ruling protected the rights of the individual, and it sets a standard that must still be followed today. This is not just my opinion, it is the law itself." The courtroom broke into whispers of astonishment. Lawyers rushed to see the file, nodding in agreement as they flipped through the pages. The students in the back scribbled furiously, unable to keep up with the speed of her brilliance. Even the clerks looked stunned. The judge stared at the file, his eyes scanning the lines. His hands trembled slightly as he realized she was right. Completely right. He had no counter-argument left. The very law he had tried to use against her now stood firmly in her favor. Silence fell again. Everyone's eyes turned to the judge. He sat frozen for a long moment, his authority crumbling under the weight of the truth. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His pride had been stripped away in front of everyone. Clara did not smile, did not gloat. She simply stood tall, her face calm, her eyes steady. She had not come to humiliate him, only to seek justice. And in that moment, it was clear to all, she had achieved it. The judge finally struck his gavel, his voice unsteady as he announced, "This court will reconvene tomorrow for final decision." His words sounded hollow, as though he already knew the outcome. Clara gathered her papers, bowed her head slightly, and walked out. As she left, the entire courtroom rose to their feet. Some clapped softly, others whispered words of admiration. For them, the plain woman who once seemed ordinary had now revealed herself as a legal genius, a force that even the proudest judge could not silence. Outside, the air felt lighter. Clara walked through the crowd without pride, without arrogance. She had fought with dignity, and tomorrow would bring the final resolution. But in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, the verdict had already been given. Clara had won. The final day of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse was more crowded than ever before. People had lined up outside since early morning, hoping to find a seat. Reporters waited near the entrance, curious to capture the story of the woman who had stunned the judge and shaken the entire courtroom. Inside, every bench was full, and those who could not sit stood silently along the walls. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, as though everyone knew they were about to witness something historic. When Clara walked in, there was a quiet respect in the room. No one laughed at her plain dress or simple shoes anymore. To the crowd, her modest appearance was no longer a sign of weakness, it was a reminder that greatness often hides in ordinary forms. She carried her papers, calm as always, her face steady, her steps unhurried. But inside her heart, she felt the weight of the moment. She knew that today would decide everything. The judge entered next. His face looked more tired than before. His robe was perfect, his chair high, but the authority he once carried so effortlessly now seemed fragile. For 4 days, he had tried to test, break, and embarrass Clara. But instead, she had revealed herself as someone far greater than he had ever imagined. Today, he would have to deliver a judgment not just on the case, but on himself as well. The gavel struck. The judge cleared his throat, his voice heavy. "This is the final session. The arguments have been made, the evidence has been presented. Now we shall conclude." Clara stood slowly, her papers in hand. She looked around the room once, seeing the faces turned toward her, the curious, the doubtful, the respectful. Then she turned back to the judge and spoke with her calm, steady voice. "Your Honor," she began, "I came here not because I wanted to fight, but because I had no choice. I was told again and again that I should not stand here alone, that I would not survive in this courtroom without a lawyer. But I believed that truth does not belong only to those with power or wealth. Truth belongs to anyone willing to seek it. And so, I studied, I prepared, and I spoke. I did not do it to prove myself. I did it because justice matters. Her words filled the room with silence. Even the sound of pens scratching paper stopped. She continued, her tone soft but unshakable. I respect this court, and I respect the law. But I also believe the law must respect the people. It should not be a wall that only the powerful can climb. It should be a door that every person can walk through. I ask not for sympathy, but for fairness. The evidence has been shown, the cases are clear, and the truth is before you. I place my trust in this court to do what is right. When she finished, she bowed her head slightly and sat down. The silence in the room deepened. Her words had not been dramatic or loud, but they carried weight, like a quiet bell that echoed long after the sound had gone. The judge sat still, his fingers clasped tightly together. His eyes did not move from Clara. For years, he had been known as a man of power, a figure who could silence anyone with a single word. But today, he was the one left silent. Clara had not just presented a case, she had reminded him of what justice truly meant. Finally, he lifted his head and spoke. His voice was slower, less sharp than before. This court has heard the arguments, he said. And I must confess, what I witnessed here was beyond expectation. This woman, though not trained in law, has shown knowledge, clarity, and respect greater than many who stand here daily. Her understanding of the law is remarkable, her arguments are precise, and her courage is undeniable. The room stirred, people exchanging looks of amazement. The judge paused, his eyes moving to Clara again. For the first time, there was no trace of arrogance in his expression. There was something else, something closer to respect. Therefore, he continued, this court rules in her favor. Justice must be served, and the law supports her claim. The matter is resolved in her benefit. A wave of sound swept through the courtroom, gasps, murmurs, even applause that quickly grew louder. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. They had come expecting a simple case, but they had witnessed something far greater, the triumph of dignity, wisdom, and truth over pride and power. Clara remained seated, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She did not raise her arms in victory, did not smile with pride. She only closed her eyes for a moment and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. When she opened them again, she stood, bowed slightly to the judge, and began to gather her papers. The judge, still seated, watched her. His pride had been broken, but in that brokenness, something new had awakened. He realized how wrong he had been, not just in underestimating her, but in forgetting the very purpose of his own role. He had once believed the courtroom was his stage, his throne. Clara had reminded him that it was not about him at all. It was about justice. Wait, he said suddenly, his voice echoing across the room. The crowd fell silent again as Clara turned to face him. The judge took a deep breath, his eyes lowering slightly in humility. I owe you an apology. I judged you by your appearance. I thought you were unworthy to stand here. But you have taught me more about justice in these days than I have learned in many years on this bench. For that, I thank you. The courtroom froze. Never before had anyone heard this judge speak such words. His apology was more powerful than his verdict. Clara gave a small nod, her expression calm. Thank you, Your Honor, she replied softly. With that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom. The crowd parted for her, people whispering her name with admiration. Some even reached out to shake her hand or simply touch her arm as she passed. But Clara moved with quiet dignity, never pausing, never seeking the spotlight. Outside, the air felt fresh, the sky clear. Clara stepped down the courthouse stairs, the sound of applause still echoing behind her. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing, voices calling her name, asking for comments. She only smiled faintly and said, "Justice is not mine alone. It belongs to all of us. Remember that." Then she walked away, leaving the crowd in awe. In the days that followed, her story spread far beyond the courthouse. Newspapers wrote about her, students studied her words, and ordinary people felt inspired. She had proven that knowledge, courage, and truth could overcome arrogance and power. The judge, too, changed. Those who once feared his harshness began to notice a softer tone in his courtroom. He listened more carefully, he spoke with more fairness, and he carried Clara's words with him: the law must respect the people. As for Clara, she returned to her quiet life. She did not seek fame, nor did she pursue power. But in the hearts of those who had witnessed her stand, she became a symbol, a reminder that sometimes, greatness comes not in loudness or wealth, but in humility, patience, and courage. And so, the story of the simple woman who faced a proud judge lived on, told again and again. Each time, it carried the same lesson: never underestimate someone because of their appearance, for within them may lie a strength and brilliance greater than anyone imagines. Clara had walked into the courtroom as a simple woman.